Good morning, everyone. And normally I say thank you for that kind introduction, whoever you are, crypto god lady. Acting Director Das is very, very disappointed that he could not be with you here today. But I'm very excited to be here. I'm Alessio Evangelista, as she said. I'm the Associate Director for Enforcement and Compliance at FinCEN, which basically means I oversee 3 offices: the Office of Enforcement, Office of Compliance, and our brand new Office of the Whistleblower, which maybe we'll talk about a little later during the Fireside chat. I am very excited to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak about the intersection of cryptocurrencies, compliance, and national security. It's at the core of FinCEN's mission. Safeguarding the financial system from illicit use is fundamental to protecting U.S. national security. Keeping illicit activity out of the cryptocurrency sector also helps instill confidence in the financial system by ensuring that the public, including customers in the cryptocurrency space, can feel comfortable that their assets and their transactions will be secure and that they won't be taken advantage of by bad actors, including criminals and malign state actors. And that's the key focus for us at FinCEN. We work to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism and related crimes like cybercrime, ransomware, drug trafficking, and human trafficking, just to name a few. But we don't do it alone. Network is in our name. We are only part of the overall effort. We are part of a whole of government effort that includes others at Treasury, law enforcement, I know there's some here, other regulators, the Congress. And to be effective, we require intensive collaboration and engagement with all of you, the industry, private sector, civil society. The President's recent executive order on digital assets outlined the U.S. government's approach to digital assets, including cryptocurrencies. The executive order said, quote, "The United States has an interest in responsible financial innovation, expanding access to safe and affordable financial services, and reducing the cost of domestic and cross-border funds transfers and payments, including through the continued modernization of public payment systems," end quote. The executive order also made clear that achieving these goals can't come at the cost of other priorities. Priorities like national security, the prevention of illicit finance, consumer protection, and financial stability. Instilling confidence in the system is what will help the cryptocurrency sector grow and achieve its full potential. One of the roles that FinCEN plays in this space is that we are a regulator with a focus on combating illicit finance. We draft rules and regulations to implement the Bank Secrecy Act, our basic fundamental law that we implement. And we work to foster and ensure compliance. That's what my division does. Many of you probably remember FinCEN because in 2020 we issued notices of proposed rulemaking related to compliance with the so-called travel rule in the cryptocurrency industry and rules related to transactions with unhosted wallets. I know you're familiar with those proposals because collectively received more than 10,000 comments from industry and other stakeholders. But we really appreciated the feedback. It is important to us that we hear from you. We read every single comment, and we are carefully considering them as we move forward. Addressing the illicit finance and national security risks related to the travel rule compliance and unhosted wallets remain top of mind for us. But as we think through next steps, and in line with the broader U.S. government approach, we try to approach rules and regulations in a way that recognizes not only the risks that innovations pose, but the opportunities they present. And we do recognize that cryptocurrency industry and its underlying technologies present opportunity. I want to go back to the quote that I read from the executive order to draw your attention to one phrase beyond all others that I think encapsulates FinCEN's approach in this space, and that's responsible financial innovation. We want to support responsible innovation, innovation that has compliance embedded in its DNA, innovation that is executed in a way that is mindful of and helps to protect our national security interests and to protect people from harm. But what does this mean? Responsible innovation means that financial institutions that operate in the cryptocurrency space have the same obligations as all other financial institutions to ensure that their new offerings can leverage innovations while still protecting consumers, reducing cybercrime, combating illicit financial activity, and ensuring that their platforms are not used to harm our national security interests. It means that financial institutions implement controls that are commensurate with the risks posed by the products and services they offer, such as services offered to customers that involve anonymity-enhanced cryptocurrencies. It means ensuring that compliance is baked into new products and conceptualization and launch. It is built into the fundamental architecture of the companies and is given serious and ongoing consideration. It can't be just an afterthought. Companies should not adopt the mentality of build first, comply later. VASPs that take this approach undermine trust in cryptocurrency-enabled finance and threaten national security. To give a more specific example, at the intersection of innovation and national security, it means making sure that platforms have appropriate protocols and controls in place to protect consumers from having their assets stolen by hackers looking to fund North Korea's nuclear missile program. Just recently, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated a mixer for the first time. The reason for the mixer designation in that mixer, Blender.io, was involved in processing a portion of the proceeds of the $620 million hack, the largest cryptocurrency heist to date. And the group behind that hack, the North Korean state-sponsored Lazarus Group. These funds were stolen to support a totalitarian regime that spends its money on developing weapons of mass destruction at the expense of feeding its citizens. Other state actors whose malign activities pose a threat to our national security, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, have publicly stated their intentions to use or develop digital currencies and/or cryptocurrencies for illicit activity, including sanctions evasion. The same goes for terrorist organizations. The connection between responsible innovation and national security is clear. There's been a lot of discussion recently about Russia turning to cryptocurrency to evade the growing net of US and international sanctions. We've acknowledged that large-scale sanctions evasion using cryptocurrency by a state actor like Russia is just not that practicable. As my Treasury colleagues have said before, you can't flip a switch overnight and run a G20 economy on cryptocurrency. Nonetheless, as we said in our FinCEN alert from early March, individual sanctioned persons, illicit actors, and their related networks may attempt to use cryptocurrency and anonymizing tools to evade US sanctions and protect their assets around the globe. We need all of you to be vigilant. That's what responsible innovation means to us. And I want to recognize that we are already seeing examples of responsible innovation and compliance-focused product development across many facets of the industry, including mining, DeFi, stablecoins, sanctions screening, blockchain tracing, and more. We're seeing things like innovative travel rule solutions, geo-blocking capabilities, the development of protocols that embed customer due diligence and sanctions screening in the protocol itself. This is all great progress and an important signal that responsible innovation is a growing part of the compliance culture in this space. Some of the innovations we're seeing would have been almost inconceivable not so long ago, and they have proven that concepts like compliance and cybersecurity are not the enemy of innovation. As Deputy Secretary Ademo said in November, quote, "There may be a misperception about the relationship between the blockchain industry and the government. There's a belief that we are at odds, but this is not how we see things. When we regulate, rather, it's with an eye toward trying to foster innovation that creates economic opportunity and advances US financial leadership while stamping out crime, abuse, and risks. We believe these goals go hand in hand with innovation," end quote. The industry can only achieve its full potential if VASPs proactively adopt and uphold high standards for compliance. What does that mean? It means that you implement a rigorous risk-based approach to compliance and to your customer relationships and transactional activity. To do so, one of the first steps is to develop a deep understanding of the risks that you face, the customers you serve, and the parties with which you transact. One area that's unique to cryptocurrency sector, of course, is the amount of information available to you by virtue of the public nature of many of the blockchain ledgers. This means you have a lot of information at your fingertips that can be used to inform your understanding of risk and shape your compliance programs. The information can provide companies in the cryptocurrency space with valuable insights into risk. fueling the more effective implementation of a risk-based approach to compliance. It's obviously not the only source of information about risk, but this data can be an important factor in companies' policies and procedures to, for example, review transactions and customer activity. You can do this at onboarding, on a periodic or event-triggered basis thereafter. To ensure you don't bring on or provide service to customers whose activities fall outside of your risk appetite. You can monitor this activity to ensure that you can recognize when a customer is acting in an unusual or potentially suspicious way. It can empower you to identify and use new information and important red flags when they become available about a wallet address. New information and red flags like an address being added to OFAC's SDN list, but not just that. I'm also talking about new innovation and red flags that, for example, link a wallet address to a cluster of wallet addresses that have been involved in illicit activity like ransomware. Too often we see VASPs that are willing to do business with problematic companies up until the day of an OFAC designation or a criminal indictment, even when there were clearly observable red flags and indicators of wrongdoing that they could, and arguably should, have taken note of long ago. This raises a question for us about the extent to which those institutions are taking a critical look at the information that is available to them, the extent to which they are applying a rigorous, risk-based approach to their operations and their decisions. VASPs that provide a platform for problematic firms like these are allowing them to continue doing harm and putting their own reputation at risk. As responsible members of the global financial system, VASPs need to help ensure that they are not allowing their businesses to be exploited by criminal elements and non-compliant VASPs that facilitate criminal activity. Financial institutions, including VASPs, must not only have compliance policies and procedures in place, they must also implement those programs effectively. They need to make risk-based decisions to file suspicious activity reports appropriately. We know the existence of a compliance program on paper does not always result in compliance. We know this because a major theme that we see in our enforcement actions are the complete lack of meaningful compliance programs, the existence of what we call sometimes paper programs, and firms that transparently prioritize, they tell you, growth over compliance. And that's where our enforcement actions comes in. It is not a gotcha exercise. These are the investigations that I oversee. It is not that a single misstep can put you in the wrong end of a sizable fine. In reality, public enforcement actions on our website show we continue to prioritize cases where we identify significant noncompliance and threats to the U.S. financial system, where there is a willful disregard or a reckless disregard for regulatory requirements. I encourage you to review these actions, both against banks and cryptocurrency exchanges or administrators. The themes are the same. These public enforcement actions take time because it is important that we get them right. Along with other public actions like the release of advisories and guidance, they are an important part of how we communicate our requirements and expectations to the financial industry. I think we've sent a clear message through these channels. AML CFT requirements apply to financial institutions dealing in cryptocurrencies and other digital assets the same way they do to financial institutions dealing in fiat. So before we turn to the Q&A answer, I just want to emphasize that we believe cryptocurrency and digital assets industry has an immense opportunity to raise the bar for the next generation of financial services. We can collectively facilitate higher industry standards for transparency, accountability, innovation. Governments cannot function without partners. We need stakeholders, VASPs, to prioritize transparency, accountability, to share information. And together, we can ensure that we're safeguarding our national security. Sure.
Is from FinCEN coming up to join us in New York, and in particular sort of bringing a little bit more of the enforcement and compliance perspective to the conversation today. I'm Caroline Malcolm. I run the public policy team internationally at Chainalysis. Just wanted to dig into a little bit of some of the issues you brought up. After a long sort of career at DOJ, you joined FinCEN about 18 months ago. So just sort of thinking, I guess, FinCEN generally, but also your role on enforcement and compliance, what are, I guess, some of the priorities that we're seeing today, but also how have they changed since you joined?
Well, I joined in December of 2020, and then in January of 2021, this little law called the AML Act of 2020 was enacted, and it is a massive change. We are spending an enormous amount of resources trying to implement that law. It involves innovation. There are provisions about innovation. There's provisions about compliance, such as a no action letter program that we're standing up. There's the new whistleblower office that I mentioned that we're standing up. And the list goes on and on. Of course, the beneficial ownership, the Corporate Transparency Act, which was part of the AML Act. So that was number one, is one of the priorities that, of course, changed overnight once that passed. The horrible events in Ukraine, of course, are a priority. All things Russia related. And there's overlap with some of the other priorities. Ransomware has been a priority and continues to be a priority and will be a priority. And then, of course, implementing the executive order, the president's executive order for digital assets. This is all a mix of, in no particular order, these are all priorities that we have in ensuring that we move forward. And underpinning a lot of that is digital identity, which you're probably addressing in some other programs.
No, look, I mean, digital identity, across governments continues to be a really significant issue. You talked a little bit about the executive order and mentioned it just again now. I guess in terms of your mission at FinCEN, how has it perhaps affected the priorities or maybe the timing of some of those things? You mentioned, for example, the notice of proposed rulemaking. What's the follow-up steps from that, and what might we see?
I mean, we're going to keep working through our regulatory agenda, and the responsible innovation piece, as I mentioned in the remarks, is core too. But we can't ignore. I mean, the executive order makes clear that we still have to make sure we focus on consumer protection issues, that illicit finance. This is not. It sent a clear message that what we're doing and what we've been trying to do, to me, is even more important now.
So there's a lot of, I guess, pressure on FinCEN to be doing a lot. What about the industry? What, in terms of some of the efforts to sort of self-police that we might have seen, particularly perhaps as it relates to DeFi, what are some of the initiatives that you're seeing out of industry which you think are particularly interesting in this space?
So I mentioned the building in some compliance into the protocols themselves, embedding it in the protocol. Also, from our perspective, when we dig in on a lot of these new products and services and protocols, they're not quite as decentralized as they claim to be. And that is something that we see time and time again. And as a result, when it's not truly decentralized, there are obligations that they have to comply with the law. But I think we are seeing, though, those that do have compliance sort of in their DNA are thinking about, before the launch, and embedding some type of, whether it's KYC, sanctions screening, some type of analytics, so that as it operates, it doesn't operate in a way that disregards all of the regulatory requirements, which of course are not designed just to make people's life difficult, right? And I know they do sometimes, but they are designed to address these horrible risks and threats.
Maybe just touching on DeFi a little bit there, and obviously this was something in the FATF guidance in 2019 and the updated guidance in 2021 in terms of, what is that? There is a spectrum of decentralization and trying to identify at which point you sort of cross over from, a fully decentralized system and reach that point. Is that something where we might expect some more sort of guidance, whether it be sort of internationally or elsewise?
Yeah, I think so. I do think that, like I mentioned, when you conduct an investigation or have a conversation with one of these protocols and find out whether they have, for example, the capability or have they ever actually stopped a transaction. And oftentimes they have. Well, is that decentralized really? Or is there some administrator who's able to actually, for whatever reason, right? And if I do think that that's something that will continue to be, we know that in the government that we have to speak to that and try to provide more guidance.
And I think sort of the example you just gave there, we know that you may have control over certain aspects, but doesn't necessarily mean you have control over the aspects which could put in place things like sanction screening, AML screening, so on and so forth. And I think sort of, as you mentioned, those sorts of fine lines are going to have to be brought out a little bit more. I think we'll see increasing demand from industry for that.
I think it's a facts and circumstances situation, and I think this is now, this is a maturing and maybe even mature industry in some ways in this regard. And any other financial institution that is entering a new line of business would have an obligation to assess the risks presented by that new line of business and what regulatory rules may apply. And that's the same for DeFi.
So that was a little bit sort of focused on the industry side. I mean, governments around the world are thinking about how to deal with digital asset frameworks. This question of decentralization obviously challenges a lot of the kind of norms of regulation making, that there's somebody always very clearly that you can sort of touch and put your hand on and put responsibilities on. If we think about that in the context of looking to ensure that policy isn't about ticking the box about these are the requirements and okay, I've done all those I've done all those and therefore I'm finished, looking more at the question of effectiveness, not only in implementation, but also that the policy meets the original goals that it was set out to reach. How are sort of governments thinking about that challenge, and about particularly FinCEN, in terms of ensuring that as we look to put things like AML rules on a still relatively emerging space with lots of new innovations coming up, how do we ensure that the policy goals are being achieved and we're not just setting up a tick-the-box exercise?
So part of it is my job through compliance and enforcement efforts to see, as I mentioned, about the paper programs, and to make sure that that's not what's happening, that it's just that you check a boxes, but you don't actually implement the program in a way that's effective. But it is still a challenge, and I think we are working with international partners and making sure, for example, through FATF, that these types of that we don't have a regulatory arbitrage situation where you can move to wherever is has the least amount of friction or controls on what you're doing. But we work bilaterally with partners, and we work through the FATF to try to make sure that these policies actually are being drafted, followed, and then implemented and enforced.
So the sort of arbitrage question is quite interesting, because decentralization is about putting a hand on somebody responsible, but it also brings up the broader issue, which we've seen in sort of technology platform companies, sort of platform business models, probably exacerbated in this space in terms of this question of jurisdictional arbitrage. Who's responsible for what, where? How are you thinking about that? Where do you see the biggest challenge from a sort of jurisdictional arbitrage perspective in digital assets?
I think that, well, for us, of course, our jurisdiction is when someone is wherever they're located, if they're operating wholly or in substantial part in the United States, they fall under our regulations. So to the extent that someone thinks, if I locate in the Seychelles, for example, but I'm servicing customers in the U.S., this was our recent enforcement action in parallel with the CFTC against BitMEX. This is you are going to be subject wherever you are operating, and not just where your servers are, or not just where your code writers are, but where you're actually engaging in activity that's regulated. This is a heavily regulated space. It's an interesting. I do find that's one of the most interesting conversations I have with people who are so excited about the technology, and they're so excited about and it is amazing, and it does provide for opportunities that may not exist in traditional finance to reduce costs, and especially cross-border payments. But this is a heavily regulated space for a reason, because of how much harm can be done. So we are focused on that, and I think the reality is, if the other jurisdictions sort of take care of their space as well, that if we're all taking care of our space and there's really the web is complete, then we'll be able to make sure that there's good conduct is rewarded and flourishes, and bad conduct is addressed.
it sort of suggests though also, on the rules, okay, so it's clear if you're selling into the market, then you'll be touched in the case of the US. But then the sort of enforcement side, actually carrying out the sort of penalty and so forth that's applied. I mean, that is no doubt also a challenge for you.
Yes, I mean, yes. I mean, we would ultimately mean enforcing the fine, and it depends on, where their assets are and where they are, and whether they want to keep operating in the U.S. or not. I mean, there are definitely levers that we can pull to encourage, to penalize bad actors. But I think that as the international community recognizes the risk and there's more cooperation, that's that ultimately, where there's no, you're talking to the enforcement guy, where there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. That's what, that's the goal, and that everyone realizes that we need to do the right thing.
Maybe final question. You talked a little bit about responsible innovation and what that sort of means. Any particular examples of responsible innovation that you've seen in the crypto digital asset space?
Well, we do have our Innovation Hours program. There are, I mentioned in the speech, there are innovative, we're seeing it's really remarkable, innovative travel rule solutions, which I think there was a time where people were like, it's going to be impossible. Not so when you put fantastic minds like are attending or are watching on the live stream. When they put their minds to it, they are seeing ways to solve some of these problems. And I personally am confident that there will be even more innovation in that space to address that the code writers are really good. A lot of them are really good. And that once they understand, for example, what the goal is, like how do we want this to operate? What is the compliance? And they just may not know. Yeah. That's the goal of having the Innovation Hours programs and having this outreach, is to explain that this is a fabulous idea, but you've got to build in a way to innovate and to do it to comply in an innovative way as well.
And I think that's very interesting in terms of where the space grows, lots of sort of new products and so forth development. But the reg tech space, I think, is going to be a really exciting one going forward.
No doubt.
Alessio, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us,
much.
everybody.